Clarence Reginald Dalby is one of the best remembered illustrators for the Railway series, having drawn 10 and a bit books in the franchise. He was a landscape artist first and foremost, which allowed him to draw some of the most atmospheric artwork seen in the Railway series books. However, keeping the trains consistent and in perspective was never a guarantee with his work. Sometimes his engines can have great proportions, other times not so much. In this video, I've decided to take 3 of his illustrations and redraw them. I want to point out that my aim isn't to fix the original illustrations or claim that my redraws are definitive. I just thought it would be a fun thing to try out, and try out I will. When I think of Railway series illustrations that look a bit off, the main one that springs to mind is this one from James and the Express. James's book was the first one that Dalby illustrated, and it certainly shows here, I think. James looks like he's about twice the size of Gordon. The context here is that Gordon has accidentally been sent onto the loop line and is trying to sneak into the station without anyone noticing him. I suppose you could argue that Gordon was illustrated as a small engine because he feels small in this scenario, and I think the TV series adaptation achieved a similar effect by filming the shot of Gordon returning to the station from a high angle. Regardless of intention, however, I somehow can't imagine that the Reverend Audrey was particularly thrilled with this inaccuracy, and so I figured that I'd redraw this illustration with the engines depicted in a more proportional manner. Originally, I was going to replicate the Dalby style for these illustrations, colour picking from the original artwork and everything. However, I changed my mind when I figured that that would not only be a bit tedious, but a bit redundant as well. Like I said before, my goal isn't necessarily to fix the original illustrations, so I might as well give them a different look overall compared to the originals. As a result, I've decided to go for a style more reminiscent of John Kenny's illustrations, since I like drawing in that style. I chose to pick the colours for this drawing from the first illustration of Hello Twins. My art isn't quite as gloomy or smoky as this, but I still think the slightly duller and more muted colours have really helped to set my version of the illustration apart from the original. The original art has a number of posters mounted on the station wall, including one for Brighton, the city where Thomas was built. I can't really tell what's going on in any of the other posters, and as you'll eventually see, I've obscured them with smoke and steam in my illustration. Although I've tried to replicate the John Kenny style, I've made sure to retain the period details from the original book, such as the lack of numbers on Gordon and James's tenders. This also means I'm not including the blood and custard livery for the coaches as Kenny tended to draw, even though I really like that livery for coaches. Instead, I've gone with the sort of brownish orange colour scheme from the original illustration, albeit with the ends of the coaches painted black, as Kenny often depicts the railway's non-corridor stock. You might notice with this illustration and the next that the engine's handrails are the final detail added to the engines. This isn't for any specific reason, other than I often just forget to add them. I'll draw them on when sketching the piece, but then neglect to add them when colouring everything in. Then I'll look at my supposedly finished illustration the following day and realise, wait a minute, where are the handrails? And quickly record myself drawing them on. With all that said, Here is the original illustration, and here is my version. The next illustration I was keen to tackle was the first illustration from Paint Pots and Queens, with the 4 big engines lined up in Tidmouth sheds. At a glance, this illustration doesn't look too bad, but it's a bit of a death by 1,000 paper cuts situation. The more you look at it, the worse it seems to get. James has grown an extra pair of wheels, but that's the least of this artwork's problems, to be honest. The shed support has been drawn in front of Henry's buffer, so if he moves forward he'll knock it down. The shed itself has no back to it. It's asymmetrical, with the 3 tracks on one side and only 1 track on the other, and the right hand side of the shed roof is not visible, even though that doesn't seem to line up perspective wise. Tidmouth Sheds is depicted rather inconsistently in the early books. Sometimes it has 3 tracks, sometimes it has 4 tracks, sometimes it has 1 overall roof, sometimes it has 2 smaller roofs, and sometimes it's just Vickerstown sheds. This would later be fixed in the John Kenny era, becoming a 4-track engine shed with a single overall roof, which we would later discover is actually the entrance to a much larger roundhouse complex. This is the design I've gone with. I wanted to make the engine's facial expressions a bit more exaggerated compared to the original drawing, particularly James and Henry. James is extremely confident that he's the one that will pull the royal train, whereas Henry thinks that that's a ridiculous idea. After all, James can't climb hills. As far as Henry is concerned, he himself is the obvious pick. Edward knows he's too old, and Gordon is in disgrace, so he knows, or at least he thinks he knows, that the job will not be going to him. Incidentally, if you notice any large gaps in my commentary, that's mainly because in instances like this, there's not really much to talk about in terms of lore. I'm not really expanding on these stories like I did in my 80th anniversary video. I really am just redrawing existing illustrations that I think were worth redrawing. Whereas with the last redraw I was working from the exact same angle as the original illustration, here you may have noticed that I've decided to draw the engines from a lower angle as compared to the original art. I suppose this makes the engines look that little bit larger. With that said and done, here is the original art, and here is my redraw. The final illustration I'm tackling for this video is the 5th illustration from Duck Takes Charge. The context here is that Duck has just arrived on Sodor and Percy is showing him round. As Duck is shunting trains for the big engines, they decide to have some fun. Their idea of fun apparently being picking on the new engine. Again, this isn't a terrible illustration on its own, but there is a bit of jank. Dolby, quite infamously, drew Duck as the wrong type of engine. In short, Duck is based on the Great Western Railway 5700 class, a general purpose pannier tank engine. Dolby, however, consistently drew Duck to resemble the smaller pannier tank engines that were built specifically for branch line passenger work, such as the 5400, 6400 and 7400 classes. The main differences are the shape of the cab, the wheel size and the tops of the tanks. The 5700s have a slight arch at the top of the tanks where the smoke box overlaps them. The other classes have completely flat tank tops. Henry also looks a bit off. Again, somewhat infamously, several books prior to this one, Audrey wrote a story where Henry gets rebuilt specifically because he was fed up with Dolby not drawing him consistently. Henry was redesigned as an LMS Black 5. And Dolby generally did a pretty great job with Henry's design from then on, keeping him accurate and consistent. But something seems to have gone awry here, since Henry appears to be morphing into an NCC Class W. On a more subjective note, I feel as though the illustration doesn't really communicate what's written in the text. The idea is that Duck is busy shunting trains when the big engines sneak up on him and tease him by making quacking noises. The illustration just shows Henry looking angrily at Duck, who isn't coupled to anything despite having a head code for a cattle train. Of course you can't really visually show a locomotive making a quacking noise, so I won't blame Dolby for that. However, I figured that I had my work cut out for me with regards to drawing this illustration. You'll notice that I've completely changed the angle of the illustration, showing the engines from more of a 3/4 side view. Whilst this wasn't the intention at first, the further I got with drawing this piece, the more I noticed it looked similar to that one illustration from Trouble in the Shed, where Percy wheeshes at Henry to make him jump. We sort of get the inverse happening here, where Henry makes a loud quacking noise to make Duck jump. Due to the angle you can't see what any of the engines are coupled to, but I've given Duck a passenger head code to show that he's handling coaches. Finally, I added some smoke and steam to the scene. Percy and Duck aren't really using a lot of steam here, but Henry certainly is. I've drawn him blowing a lot of steam at Duck, mainly due to being inspired by the TV series adaptation of this story, where the three big engines basically engulf Duck in smoke and steam. And so, here is the original illustration, and here is my version of it. And there you have it, 3 illustrations from the Railway series that are maybe a bit on the janky side, re-illustrated by myself. Again, I'd just like to reiterate that I'm not claiming to be a better illustrator than Dolby, or that I'm fixing these illustrations by redrawing them. This was just something I wanted to do for a bit of fun. Let me know your thoughts. Perhaps there are other illustrations from the books that you'd like to see redrawn, or perhaps you're just wondering what I've got in store for next week. Either way, be sure to comment down below and subscribe.